No problem. Thank you.
Okay, good morning from China, good evening from the United States, and welcome to Haz Al Din for the third and final interview of my series, which is about Maga Communism. Now, I'm pretty excited today because Haz is the guy who coined the phrase, and therefore quite famous globally. So thank you for agreeing to come on the show, Haz, and many of my followers around the world, but mostly a lot of my followers are Chinese diaspora. We have this idea that MAGA communism is very much like socialism with Chinese characteristics. And really what I wanted to do with you was to kind of sit down and talk about where it came from, what it is, and how it developed. So can you describe the moment for me that you first realized that there was something going on, and then you came up with this theory that MAGA was actually looking for socialism?
Yes. So I think that the important context we need to hit home is the state of the so-called American left for the past few decades since the collapse of the USSR. Let's say, um, there's this issue of perpetual failure. There's this issue of a perpetual inability to achieve political successes or even ideological successes. To be honest,
Hmm.
among the left. When I say the left, I don't mean the Democrats. I mean like what would be considered internationally like a real left. And I think we got kind of close with Bernie Sanders, who repopularized the term socialism, but
Hmm.
he failed to win the primary twice. You know, his second performance was even more pathetic. So people like myself started to notice a pattern. We're kind of trying to engage in self-criticism. Why is it that left-wing politics in America, in the West, is failing? What is holding us back? Is it just
Hmm.
that people are too comfortable and they don't see a need for socialist or communist politics? Well, maybe that excuse would have sufficed before the 2008 financial crisis, but after that, there's absolutely no excuse. And then we see the rise of the populist right, which is filling the vacuum of where the traditional left wing is supposed to be. And it's just a kind of baffling situation. What is wrong with the left? Because there has to be something wrong with the left. I mean, some leftists say that actually the problem is America. The problem is that Americans are just too privileged and they're not interested in incendiary, anti-establishment
Hmm.
or counter hegemonic politics, which is clearly wrong. I mean, we've seen the rise of that very clearly in the MAGA movement itself with Trump. So that theory was disproven. And I think in a way that was really humiliating for the established left. So we came around and, we started to notice, I started to notice, myself, colleagues, and others, well, wait a second. Why is it that leftists have written off a huge portion of the population that would otherwise be receptive to his messaging? Why is it that, working class, blue collar working class people, rural people, people the most dissatisfied with the system, why have they been completely written off? Why does nobody believe that is actually a subject of left wing politics anymore? Why is it that instead they choose to kind of engage in a self congratulatory form of politics where they try to organize graduate students and they try to appeal to people who come from backgrounds similar to themselves? I mean, Marxists understand that the intelligentsia is not the revolutionary subject. Although the intelligentsia plays a role, the Marxist one specifically, we have a duty to go down to the masses, not to congregate amongst ourselves and be comfortable amongst ourselves.
Hmm.
And I started to witness how the excuses they were making for avoiding any kind of contact with what we consider, I mean, the real masses, right, was that these people are too politically incorrect. They're too bigoted. They hold problematic views. Superficially, they are obviously hostile to communism. And I kind of did not find that as a satisfactory response from them. I said, why is left wing politics failing? Why are we writing off so many people when it would be so easy to win them over if we just were able to sift through and look past the kind of superficial false consciousness that they currently have and actually not just communicate with them, but also humble ourselves? A lot of the kind of politically correct, out of touch mentalities and ideas that people have been developing in academia or these urban bohemian circles of trendy youth. I I mean, we need to step outside of that and maybe gain a perspective that we ourselves don't have immediately. And so that original instinct was that original position, which we put forward very early on, really put us. We really started butting heads with the gatekeepers of radical leftist politics in the United States. They and waged a vicious campaign of defamation, of character assassination, attempted doxing. I mean, you name it. They did deplatforming, trying to get us censored and removed. We did not begin with an inflammatory position. We didn't begin with an offensive position. We simply began with a position that they correctly identified was threatening their status as gatekeepers. We said, okay, enough of this circle jerking. The limited amount of attention and prestige that you've gained as a leftist, influencer pales in comparison to the attention we could be getting and the support we could be getting among masses of people outside of your small circle who you've written off. So for years, we waged a really, really harsh struggle against these gatekeepers just to defend what I would imagine would be a very reasonable position for any outsider. But again, it's a simple dynamic of gatekeepers trying to prevent their position from being undermined. But when it comes to the principles they claim to defend, and when it comes to the principles they're basically justifying themselves on the basis of, they are betraying that. They want to hold on to their kind of privileged position at the expense of making socialist or communist politics actually viable in this country. So that culminated, that bitterness and that hostility we had with them culminated in a kind of breaking point where we said, you know what, instead of arguing with these leftists and just defending ourselves for years, we need to start a new chapter and move on from it and recognize that the people we need to be talking to is not graduate students in universities. They're not, urban bohemians or, extremely marginal, tiny segments of the population. They're actually the blue collar working class that forms the bedrock of dissident politics in this country. And we didn't say that they're automatically communist. We didn't say that they're going to automatically be receptive to our view. We basically were saying this is a new chapter of communist politics in this country. All the, postmodern leftism after the dissolution of the USSR, that all failed. So we need to turn a new page. And communist politics in America needs to be built, first of all, on a basis of recognizing its past traditions and learning from those successes, such as the Communist Party's heyday in the 1930s. It also needs to recognize that it needs to step outside of the leftist bubble and really begin a dialogue with the MAGA masses to the point where the dissident politics, the very vague, ambiguous dissident politics held by MAGA working class people, can be guided in such a way that it discovers a more communistic essence.
Do you think that the word communist is holding you back from a lot of people? The way I view it, I don't view myself as a communist or a socialist. I live in a communist and quite socialist country, and I see how this works really well. I mean, I'm a big proponent for the Communist Party of China, not because they're communist, because it really does work for the people here. And this is a fact. 90% of people in China, this is a proven fact, have great satisfaction with their government. But the word communist in America seems to be the thing. Why is it so vilified?
Well, I think it's vilified for reasons pertaining to the huge apparatus of propaganda, of misinformation, backed by an actual authority. That's very important. It's backed by an actual power and authority, which is the military-industrial complex, which is the federal agencies, which is basically the powers that be in this country, the media, the powers of force in this country, as well as the established political powers here, are all based on anti-communism. I mean, the Cold War attempted to drape anti-communism in a kind of jingoistic, patriotic flag, even to the point where American identity today seems inexorably tied to anti-communism, even in a kind of ironic way, self-ironic way, and so on. So I think that what we're up against is very clear. However, regarding the question of why we continue to insist on calling ourselves communists, I think it is true that we would probably have more successes just repeating and laundering, I guess, the messaging of the established dissident right, I would say, which MAGA people are already used to, which is a message they already trust. And if we insert ourselves as middlemen disseminating that message, we could grow a very large platform and become very popular. But the reason we refuse to do that and why we insist upon the term communism is because it is a matter of operational necessity in our view. And what I mean by that is that communism is not just a specific prescription to remedy society's ills. It's also a way of creating a new and different form of political power, which is premised upon the basis of an operational distinction between the organized cadres, the party, right, who are class conscious warriors, and the masses at large, whose education level is obviously going to be much lower. Even in China today, as you know yourself, which is ruled by a communist party, I believe, and you may correct me if I'm wrong, only 10% of the population is actually part of the Communist Party. So part of the responsibilities and duties of a communist party isn't necessarily to pander to the masses and just tell them and use the exact same language that they're used to just to garner, support from them. It's creating a dialogue between a method, what we call science, and the state of consciousness that the masses are at. And in building that bridge and creating that dialogue, the two work upon each other to produce what can be called a communist movement, right? A movement that is based on class consciousness, which is based on the application of a specific kind of method and outlook and theory, and which ultimately seeks to reach the heights of state power to guide the development of history and guide, as China does, the development of the productive forces.
Do you think that the United States, is it going through enough of a change? Most communist emergences come out of a period of great upheaval. China's and Russia's particularly did. But I mean, if you take a look at most places, they did come from a period of great upheaval. Do you think America has enough of an upheaval now? I'm looking at, I see statistics. I've never been to the United States, let's be honest. I'm quite critical of the United States because they're extremely critical of China, which is a country I've grown to love. I didn't like it at first, I have to be honest there too. But what I've seen happening in America, you've got a very large drug problem, very large gun problem, very large poverty problem. You've got employment is not, there's a lot of jobs, people have jobs, but many people have to do 2 or 3 jobs in order to survive. So it looks to me like the country is ready for a major change. Do you think America is going through enough of a change yet to make that happen?
Absolutely. I think that the deep systemic dysfunction the United States is facing is simply irreparable within the confines of the existing system. And even to the extent that Americans are comfortable, and let's not kid ourselves, Americans live better than the average person in a developing country. There's no doubt about that. But even to the extent that they do, this is based off of the veneer of a system which is irreparably dysfunctional, which simply cannot continue working. And we can look at this in the form of credit card debt. We can look this in terms of U.S. national debt. It's simply unsustainable. The financial architecture that is at the foundation of this country and the sense of normalcy that, pacifies the masses, I suppose. The cracks have started to show after 2008 for a long time. Trump rode a wave of discontent precisely off of this kind of inability to disguise it anymore. And now the extent of the political polarization, and this is the most important thing, has become so severe, has become so acute that it's even beginning to penetrate and overwhelm the traditional kind of systems of governance and state legitimacy that used to be off limits, such as the judiciary, right? Judicial independence seems to be gone now. There's obviously the legislature and the executive branch have always been the case, but most importantly, I think this time around is that also the security establishment, the CIA and the FBI, have become politicized, seemingly against Trump, against the MAGA movement. So the polarization has cut through every institution of political power in this country. I do not see how that can be repaired without, and even then, I don't know if it's possible. And I think this is what the ruling classes in the United States are banking on, the U.S. engaging in a war, full-scale mobilization against another country, which they may hope will reunify the country. But I mean, as we know, this year is an election year, and I no longer believe that another civil war or otherwise breakdown of political authority in the United States is a science fiction scenario. For many communities, I think it's already the case. For many communities in cities, there are no-go zones for the police, right? Police simply cannot go in certain neighborhoods and certain blocks. You look at Chicago, you look at Detroit. And for a long time, people thought this was just an issue of some marginal communities and poverty, but it's starting to also become clear that the forces of the security establishment are having a hard time exerting control. I mean, the FBI is overwhelmed dealing with the MAGA movement and the militia movement and QAnon and so on and so on. And I think, what we should expect for the future of the United States is probably something like, I don't know if we can even mention it on YouTube, a certain date that happened in January 2021.
I'm not monetized.
Yeah.
I won't be demonetized. So go ahead. Fire
January
away.
6th, but magnified on a scale that we probably would consider science fiction, just unimaginable. Now, I'm not saying this optimistically. I'm not saying that there's going to automatically be some like communist revolution. If anything, there's going to be a breakdown of law and order and chaos. It'll be like the Wild West.
Wow.
But as you said, contexts like these historically have been the ones in which communists really defined a lasting relationship to history. And I think, although it's kind of difficult for us to admit, I think us coming from the MAGA communist camp, I mean, that is really what we are expecting on the horizon. We don't think that we're going to somehow, establish communism as a movement in this country on the basis of things continuing. We're really kind of preparing for the scenario I just described, and that's really going to be the test of this, I think.
Do you think it's possible, Haz, that as a movement, the MAGA communist movement, could you kind of set up local chapters, local leadership, local support, and eventually build that up and avoid a potential revolution just by purely building up through the democratic process and then getting yourselves elected to a point where, I mean, you'll know George Galloway in the UK, I'm fairly sure. So he's just done this, and he's got a huge support base and an election looming in the UK. It's quite possible that we might not necessarily see a change in the two-party system, but certainly a third party coming in as a real contender for future elections. Is that possible through MAGA?
It's our goal. Our goal is not to kind of engage in some kind of crazy adventurism. Our goal is to establish a real form of organization that builds legitimacy, yes, by participating in the political process that we're able to, right? And so the process of forming chapters has already begun informally, actually. And that is going to be part of an official organization, probably as early as this summer.
Okay.
So yeah, I mean, we do believe in fielding candidates. We do believe in participating in the political process. We do believe in actually building political power and building legitimacy through the regular channels of sovereignty that are available to us. But we're just also mindful in the back of our heads that the event of the breakdown of the political system and law and order, that's also a possibility. And we also see fit to also take that into consideration and create a form of organization that could potentially survive and weather that kind of situation. So I definitely reject any kind of like anarchistic view, which just, or some crazy nut job view of just like, oh, we're just going to prep for the apocalypse and wait in a bunker or something.
Happy to hear that.
Yeah.
Is it possible that there's a 70 or even 80-year-old law preventing people from being members of the Communist Party, which has never been cut out of your legislation, still exists? Is it possible that organizations like the FBI and your Homeland Securities would invoke that kind of a law and prevent you? I know it would cause massive court cases with First Amendments and things.
Yes, definitely. If communism as a movement ever gained traction in this country, even minimally to a small minimal extent,
Mm,
that would be what we would expect. However, I will say that in the court cases in which this was fought by the CPUSA in the past, I believe they actually were able to prevail in the courts. But as we know, the FBI and the kind of these federal laws, I mean, the persecution itself devastated the CPUSA. Even they were able to fight it in court. The damage had already been done.
yeah, yeah.
So, I mean, that's what we expect. We expect a suspension of civil liberties and so-called democratic rights. And again, this is, I mean, going back to Lenin, who is pioneering the party form that communist parties take for granted. The goal is to prepare for both scenarios. I mean, operate out in the open as much as you can. And
Mhm.
as for the other alternative, I mean, have an operational and organizational structure that can endure that, if you catch what I mean. I mean,
Okay.
just to be able to survive and continue organizing and spreading the message and so on and so forth, whether that's through regular or irregular channels of communication. But
Mm,
I definitely, I mean, put it this way. Already the CPUSA is compromised by the FBI. I mean, we're almost 100% certain of that. And our initiative to restore and revive the CPUSA is what immediately triggered a wave of character assassination, smearing, I mean, you name it, calling us
mm.
fascists, whatever, on social media. Soon as we tripped over that pressure plate, that it's like a trap, like a booby trap or something. Soon as we walked over that, mentioning the CPUSA, very mysteriously, it's like the bots were activated, and it was our reputation was severely damaged among many people who would otherwise, on the leftist side of things, be receptive to our message.
Is this what you think happened to people like, I mean, for example, we got the AOC, Bernie Sanders. These people seem to come into politics with leftist ideas and then seem to kind of fade into the norm. I've got Fernando Munoz Banel, who's a good friend of mine. Think how many identified with AOC or Bernie. How many of these people come with the ideal that socialism is a good thing, and then they find themselves in the Senate or the Congress or wherever they are in positions of some authority and find it's just impossible to promote anymore? What happened?
I mean, it's a combination of factors. We think the most outstanding one is the working in the Democratic Party itself
Hmm.
means a lack of political independence in the first place. Second
Right.
of all, there's much to be said about the character of Bernie Sanders and AOC. I mean, to put it mildly, I guess in the most polite possible terms, they simply don't have backbones. These are simply people of low principle, low character, low honor. And yes, Bernie Sanders decided that Trump was more of a threat than the necessity of an alternative form of politics in the form of socialism or something else. So he just totally sold out to Biden. As for AOC, I mean, she is just a kind of celebrity, I guess, who really let the fame go to her head,
Mm.
had no accountability by the grassroots either, and she was very easily bribed. Is It's pretty clear that's what happened. I mean, Nancy Pelosi and all these kinds of people came to her. The media gave her such a glamorous coverage and kind of propelled her into stardom. They really turned her into a kind of icon.
Hmm.
And she let it all go to her head. And what is measly principled socialistic or progressive politics in the face of all of that? I mean,
Yeah. Yeah,
you
it's
know,
hard. It's hard to compete with. Jason just asked a great question, which I've been asked because you're the third of my series of three. Um, is it possible? I mean, does MAGA communism need Donald Trump, or do you think Donald Trump might need MAGA communism?
definitely the latter, but to be honest, definitely the latter as opposed to the former if I have to choose. But to be honest, it's not so much about Trump. It's not even so much about MAGA as a kind of
Mm,
end state of politics. It's about recognizing that it is formed an integral and irreversible part and chapter of the history of working class resistance in this country, however imperfect, however guided by false consciousness. It's just irreversible. If you don't acknowledge among the working classes the impact of MAGA on sowing and creating this unprecedented distrust in established institutions, especially the media, that's a very important one. There is no way to communicate with the working class in this country at all. At the very
mm.
least, you need to recognize that this has been a chapter and experience of their history that we cannot just go pretend didn't happen and say, oh, that was a big mistake. It was totally meaningless. Let's just do this instead. So MAGA communism is really about basically conceding the transformative significance of MAGA to American politics and saying, yes, MAGA did succeed in doing this. There's no going back. But where do we go from here? And that's where the communism stuff comes into play. It's where we go from here. And where we go from here, in our view, is American communism as a form of politics and as a movement.
Yeah. Was there a moment where you said to yourself, "Hang on a second, these all these followers of Trump who are wearing the MAGA caps and the MAGA t-shirts, was there a moment you said, hang on a second, they want the same things we want? What caused that to happen? Because it's the most unexpected thing to find a leader of a small but significant communist movement looking at this huge group of 70, 80 million people and saying, wow, we actually want the same thing. How did that manifest itself?
That was very early on. I mean, for me, that was as early probably as 2019, but it took the form of a strategy. I thought, okay, Bernie Sanders needs to understand the people he needs to win are those people that he lost in 2016
Hmm.
because of his lack of a political background. So I was still hopeful that Bernie Sanders could kind of take a lot of that energy, those MAGA red hat wearing people. It's like, okay, Trump was here for 4 years. He rescinded on his promises. This is an easy win. Bernie just has to kind of speak to these people and we can get rid of the MAGA stuff and whatever. But yeah, obviously those people want the same things as us. And it was just a calamitous failure on his part. And
Hmm.
and what outraged us and me personally was that so-called leftists didn't learn the lesson. They didn't learn why that was a failure. They continued doubling down and insisting about how they were right and everyone else was wrong, and that the reason why Bernie didn't win is because not everyone is as smart as they are, and that it just kind of like reinforced their sense of conceit. And I'm like, what? On what basis do you have that conceit? You have no success or real world significance to
Mm.
show for it. It was just outrageous. And MAGA communism really was a realization that the strategy that I was hoping for Bernie in 2020 or 2019, that was never possible because it underestimated how much MAGA has irreversibly created a polarization in this country. There's just no going back from the way in which people have lost confidence in the media. There's no going back to that. And I think most leftists or self-proclaimed socialists in America begin from a perspective of taking for granted the established institutions and talking down to MAGA people from the perspective of the media and academia and universities, and basically telling them, yeah, socialism is true, and look at this expertise I'm going to use as a source of credibility. And they don't
Yeah.
realize that is completely, out the window. There's no way for communism. And one last thing, I don't mean to ramble, but it's like,
No, it's okay. Keep going.
an important detail here is it's an irony, is the same ways in which establishment liberals dismiss MAGA people and, oh, that's fake news, that's misinformation, you're just not as educated, you're illegitimate. They use the same talking points against socialists, and they used it against Bernie too, and communists. They also had the same thing. Oh, socialism clearly doesn't work. Communism clearly doesn't work. Marxism is false. It's completely wrong. You're out of touch with reality. The experts don't agree with you. Our expertise shows that, what you're pushing for is totally not in reality, et cetera, et cetera. So, that should have been the biggest hint that one of the most fundamental factors in politics, if not the most fundamental factor today, is just like media. You're putting a message out there. What are the forces standing in the way of that message being amplified with respect or authority in a way that people could rally to? Who stands in the way of that? Of course, it's MAGA's problem was the same exact problem that left-wing people in the United States had. It was the same exact one. But they continued to beg and plead before these liberals to basically say, no, please, socialism is legitimate. Communism is legitimate. It is totally in line with the expert knowledge in the universities and in the media. And they continue playing this game of just trying to be credible within institutions and failing, instead of trying to be credible among the masses, where they have a much higher chance of success.
Have you I'm sure you're aware of this. I live in China. I know what China looks like. I don't know if you've ever been here, but China is a great example of how socialism is successful, can be successful. It's a massive country. There are 1.5 billion, almost 1.5 billion people, and their poverty level has been eradicated. There is no abject poverty, but that means there's still probably 500 million poor people in China. But it's only, if you think about the country, it's only 50 years old. So effectively, 1.5 billion people in 50 years have been lifted to a point where there is no poverty, doesn't exist. There is no homelessness, that doesn't exist. Street crime, almost non-existent. I can't remember the last one. I had my phone stolen in Guangzhou 2 years ago. And my phone was stolen because I left it in a toilet. So some opportunistic guy picked it up and said, "Oh, I found a new phone," put it in his pocket and walked away. That's the extent of theft as it's occurred to me in the last 10 years. Before that, I was robbed once, but it was 2004. Basically, we've got a country here which is really, really working. I can walk out. In fact, I'm comfortable with my wife walking out at night and saying, "I'll be back at 1 o'clock in the morning." And I know she'll be back at 1 o'clock in the morning safe, even if she walked home. No problem whatsoever. That's China right now. Yet, at the same time, there are two pieces of legislation in the United States that have built in, one of them is $500 million, and the other is $250 million, in order to produce negative reports about this country. So that's what you're up against. How does your movement compete with literally, we're talking literally almost $1 billion in negative publicity? They're not interested in just bad news. They're interested in how can we make this look even worse. So yeah, we have some bad news in China, but every single thing, and you've seen the headlines, the famous one is, China cures cancer, but are they moving too quickly? China has 5% growth, but is it too fast? China is exporting to the underdeveloped world, but watch out for the backlash. This is all because of this money. And then academia can apply for this money, and they can actually study us in China and say, China, that may look good, but here's the real problem. And we've been watching the collapse of China for at least 40 years. 1990 was the first time, or 34 years ago, 1990 was the first time I saw a headline that says China is about to collapse. And it was in The Economist, and it hasn't changed since. Even yesterday, the announcement was made, China's growth is better than expected, but is it real? You know, this is what America has done to China. How can you overcome that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And to go back to MAGA, whether you agree with the content of its ideology, I don't. MAGA believes in a lot of nonsense, especially about China. But that's not the point. The point is, we think that there's an added significance of Marxist analysis when it comes to media theory. How do you build a counter-hegemonic media? We can't compete with their funding and with their money. Well, what's a good example of a movement that has been able to compete with the media and sustain messaging and a form of consciousness at odds with it? It's precisely and exclusively MAGA in the American context. That is one of the most fundamental reasons for MAGA communism, is just our ability to appreciate how they were able to resist the media, right? And all of the billions of dollars behind it. So why is that, though? And I think that's where Marxism comes in. The reason for it is because those billions of dollars that are used by the media to spread fake news, whether it's domestically or abroad, there's a few things, but that comes from the power and the hegemony, as Gramsci would put it, of the ruling class, of the capitalist class. Now, Trump was a member of that class, or is a member of that class personally, but it's not who he represents, right? He's not representing people that come from a background similar to him. He is just a kind of symbol of millions and millions of masses of ordinary people outside of the hegemony, mainly blue-collar working-class people, aggregating in small numbers their money, their attention. That's the most important thing, because social media was the game changer to actually compete with the hegemony. And they did so on the back of mass, the power in numbers as masses. And it's kind of a telltale strategy of working class politics since forever is, okay, they have all the money and resources, but what do we have? We have the numbers. And social media has allowed the working class to use its numbers to its advantage. Whether the messaging it's putting out or it's cultivating, or whether that the content of the media, alternative media ecosystem is perfect or is adequate, is a different question. But it is different from what the media, the establishment media, is saying. And then, we think there's an added significance of communism too, in terms of understanding the structures at play, because before there's domestic fake news, the first machine for the propagation of fake news was targeted to foreign adversaries, beginning with the Cold War. This is what the CIA, and the kind of, MAGA calls the deep state, I think correctly, one of its primary purposes was information dominance over the USSR in spreading fake news about socialist countries and adversaries of the US in general, to build consensus for invasions, for aggressive military posture, for the military-industrial complex, and so on. The lies that are being told about China today, they're nothing new. The U.S. has always been telling lies about China, even before the reform and opening up. The ingenuity of the imperialist system, actually, was somehow its ability to keep up the demonization of China after the Mao era, where it had embraced, an open economy that is modernized, advanced, dynamic, not dogmatic or ideologically rigid in any kind of way, led by a leadership, though principled, which is pragmatic and kind of flexible. The fact we've been able to maintain this image of China in the U.S. as this totalitarian nightmare is testament to the dynamism and efficacy of the hegemony, the information hegemony. But MAGA has shown a way to challenge that from within, I think. And square one is being able to harness and learn from that. And I think at this level, that's why I've observed, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, it seems like there's a kind of almost strange form of informal solidarity that adversaries of the US have with the symbol of Trump and MAGA. I went to Russia recently, for example, in Moscow, and everyone I talked to is like, yeah, Trump, we hope he wins next time. And I have friends on Chinese social media who tell me that both ironically, semi-ironically, and with a slight degree of seriousness, Chinese netizens do prefer Trump. They do prefer uh, him because he called out the fake news media. I
Yeah.
mean, regardless of his problematic views, it's a very kind of important dynamic I think they recognize.
There's a couple of factors there. I have a lot of Chinese friends, of course. I've lived here many, many years. So there's a couple of factors. One is most Chinese people feel, and this is a Confucianism thing, they feel that Biden is being abused. He's an elder and he shouldn't be doing what he's doing. They will treat, like when Kissinger came across here, he's widely respected. And the interesting thing about Kissinger, for all of the evils that America perpetuated during his era, he never harmed China. I mean, and I'm not saying what he did was for the benefit of China. He did it for the benefit of America, but China never got harmed by it. Perhaps the worst thing that happened was the 1979 raiding party invasion of Vietnam. And that was during that Kissinger's era, but it's actually just after Kissinger left his post. So there's a lot of things going on there about Biden. But the other thing is, everybody here recognizes that Trump didn't start a war. He didn't stop any wars, but he didn't start any wars, and they like that. They feel that he doesn't like China because he immediately slapped tariffs on, but he said he was going to slap 100%, and he slapped 25% tariffs on Chinese cars. Or, it was a lot less than that. A lot of political rhetoric comes out, and then the reality is, what do we do? So Trump is more popular here, in my opinion. And I mean, I've never researched this, but just the people I speak to, because he's more interesting and he is less dangerous, and also he's not as old. So if you're given a choice between these two, the older person ought to be at home being looked after. The younger person is a lot more interesting than the older person. So that's kind of what it is. I've never seen anyone, there's no movement, there's no informal or formal movement to say we would prefer Trump or we would prefer Biden. Chinese people simply don't care. It won't make much difference. I don't think it will make much difference, whichever one is in power. But I think most people agree that if Trump is in power, then the world is a slightly more stable place. The Chinese-American relationship isn't going to get much better, but the world is more stable with Trump, I think.
Yeah, I mean, and I myself don't harbor illusions about Trump. As a matter of fact, I have an eye open because I think there's also a possibility that he may be someone that the ruling class is just going to allow to win. In return, he's going to build consensus for a major war that he'll say, "Oh, I didn't choose this war, but we have to fight it now."
Right.
And there's many possibilities there. But for us, MAGA and Trump are not exactly the same exact thing. One is just this kind of alternative media ecosystem, and the other is an unpredictable person whose loyalties are absolutely not clear to anyone. In the best case scenario, he is just a kind of silly egotist who just cares about himself. In the worst case scenario, he is doing the bidding of other forces. So, but in either case, the task of communists is to appreciate why it is that masses of people in this country have channeled their discontent in the direction of MAGA and what that means for them, and an ability to form the minimum of solidarity. You know, it's almost as simple as, I mean, I don't drink myself, but it's like share a beer with a MAGA person, and let's toast to the fact that the fake news media is lying to us about Ukraine. They're lying to us about everything. I mean, there's a minimum kind of dimension and plane of solidarity that's there, which is I think is an important context for dialogue. I don't see that among the demographic that is hardcore Democrat, especially not now. I think those people have become increasingly dogmatic and kind of even rabid in many ways, very aggressively hostile. I mean, I visited a MAGA rally a few years ago. Everyone was very calm and just seemed like a lot of normal people. Just a very chill atmosphere, so to speak. And then there were these liberal protesters on the outskirts, like on the fences, and they were like screaming and they were just losing their minds. And I just thought, I was like, well, that's an interesting dynamic, because you would think, I thought it was the opposite. I thought that the liberals are the kind of easygoing, late night with Jimmy Fallon or whatever, and they're just kind of joking and relaxed. And it's the MAGA people who are angry and tense. But
Mm.
what I saw with my own eyes was the exact opposite of that. And I think
Right.
there's a dangerous significance to that anger, profound anger, which many liberals have, because it's an anger based not in discontent and resentment with the system, but one that's based in a kind of desire for revenge against the perceived class humiliation that MAGA people inflicted upon them. Many of these people are from respectable professions and are part of reputable, quote unquote, institutions. Many of them are people like the ones creating this fake news about China and so on. But
Mm.
they
Mm.
have a lot of prestige. They have a lot of kind of clout and currency in the institutions that they're in. And when some redneck MAGA guy who's chewing tobacco in his pickup truck comes and says, "No, you're an idiot and you're wrong and I'm right," they find that very humiliating. They find that
Yeah.
outrageous, and it's like they want revenge against this kind of movement, which seems to have denigrated their standing among the masses.
So as your movement consolidates, which I'm quite certain it will, because you really you've got the ideals for a socialist society. So as your movement consolidates and as it grows, obviously Trump is not the, if there was let's say you've got Republicans, Democrats, and MAGA communists, or whatever name you call yourself as you become a powerful force. Trump is not the leader of this. What kind of characteristics would your president have? And I mean, am I talking to a future president of the United States, the leader of the MAGA communism movement? Because if I am, I'll put a note in my diary and say I talked to him before he was famous.
No, I don't. I don't have any kind of such ambitions, and I know that this is a country which is multicultural, but there is an added significance to the fact that although I was born here, I do culturally come from a slightly different background than most Americans are used to or familiar with. So for me, I think the significance I like to have is as a kind of theorist. And that's why I
Mhm.
kind of regard myself as the theorist of the MAGA movement. And as far as a future president that we'd like to look for, I think what we would like is someone who is American but similar to Xi Jinping in their excellency, in their professionalism, in their cool-headedness, in their very lofty and wide outlook, sweeping outlook, with vast historical knowledge and wisdom, and traits that typically are looked for in kind of quintessential communist leaders. And I think, that leader will show themselves in good time.
Mm.
Uh, as far as it's going to be up to the American people, obviously, to choose
Of
who
course,
their
yeah.
leader is going to be. I
So,
think my colleague Jackson Hinkle, I am extremely impressed, especially as how young he is, with
mhm.
how much he's been able to do, his work ethic, his attitude, his mentality, always this kind of positive mentality, regardless of hardship, this relentless work ethic. I've never seen anything like it. And this kind of ability to learn and understand things very quickly and act intuitively very well. I think he has great leadership traits. And to be honest, I would like to see Jackson as a U.S. president one day,
Okay.
if the office of presidency would was still around. That is.
The difference between an American president and a Chinese president is very much how they get there. Donald Trump had absolutely no public service experience. and became a president. He's not the first to do that. Ronald Reagan was he was a governor and he had some administrative experience, but a former movie star. So you have some popularity as well. Xi Jinping came through. I mean, we talk about him coming through the ranks and starting as a digging trenches and stuff. He was never really that. And I mean, let's be realistic about this. He did get pushed into poverty because of his father's position. His father was purged during the Cultural Revolution. He went out to he literally did go out to the fields to be a worker. This is a very common thing. And he came out of that a stronger person. And then he gave up. This is his most interesting thing. He had a plum job in Zhongnanhai, in the government building. He was an advisor to a very, very senior vice premier, and he gave it up. And he went back to the grassroots to become an administrative worker inside of a local government, and then built up from there. So eventually he became a provincial party leader, a provincial governor, and then a Politburo member, and then president. So what we've got in China, you can't get to be that position unless you have that grassroots experience. And he must have known that. I wonder if he was ambitious at that time and thought, one day I will be the president of China. Maybe he just thought, one day I'll be in the Politburo or something, because his boss was. And it's something that is missing in American politics. How do you get somebody who has served on the local council, maybe served as a mayor, maybe served as a governor, before they can become? Is that a possibility that could happen under MAGA? Or under MAGA communism?
It's not possible to happen under our current constitution and political system in general. China, one of the great things about it is it's mastered, I think, and I don't want to be too flattering, but this is just my observation, an ability to maintain a close relationship between political power and the people, precisely through the mechanism you just mentioned of how much a grassroots background, being responsive to people's needs locally, can carry you through the ranks of the party to eventually acquire a position of power. And this is sociologically, I think this undermines the phenomena of oligarchy, of close circles of gatekeepers, so to speak, isolated from the masses on some kind of ivory tower, retaining their position at the expense of the necessities of history. And the brilliant thing about China, I think, and this is one of the things about it that I find so fascinating and so commendable, and I don't mince words when I say I think it is the most advanced political system we have right now, humanity has now. And I know it has problems, but I'm just saying compared to everything else, is because Xi Jinping's rise to power and his presidency, it almost seems revolutionary. I mean, he's really breaking up a lot of established powers through his anti-corruption campaign. He's implementing sweeping changes and reforms, a bold new spiritual outlook and a new direction. And all of this was able to happen in not only in a totally nonviolent way, but in a way that was in continuity with the established system they had before. And he was able to do that. There was a need among the Chinese people for a new direction and a new change. And rather than the polarization that we see in the United States taking place there, tearing the system apart from within, it was all able to kind of happen arguably in a seamless way, right? In a way, in continuity. So to me, that shows that their political system is much more mature than ours. And
they've had a lot of experience.
Precisely. And the American system, I don't think it's designed even to be responsive to the dynamic and changing needs and moods of the people. You basically have a very rigid formalism, which is blind to the kind of more partial demands of the people and the population. What I mean by that is that, for example, the need to have these overwhelming drives and plans, specific plans to build infrastructure or whatnot. The system we have is a kind of what they would call in Marxist lingo bourgeois formalism, where everything is kind of etched in stone, regardless of changes in history, regardless of changes in the development of the productive forces. And basically, the job of the courts is to maintain that and make sure nothing deviates from that. And when people have needs, and when they have aspirations which cannot be satisfied within that rigid formalism, it just kind of causes conflict,
Hmm.
and almost a revolutionary scenario where of populism, where pitting masses of people against the institution. So the institutions that exist in America are not responsive to the demands of the people, or the aspirations of the people, I should rather say.
Yeah.
And
America doesn't have an NPC, and I think that may be why. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of the NPC. They're kind of the forgotten heroes of the Chinese governance system. These are people drawn from the community. There's some of them are they're all selected, but you can self-nominate. So mostly they're selected. People are asked, why don't you stand for the NPC? Then they are elected. So they don't automatically get a position in the NPC. And they're elected by people who know them effectively in their own communities. And then usually they sit on the provincial NPC, the National People's Congress, but there's a provincial People's Congress too. And these are the people who come up with the ideas to say, we need new laws. Some of them are street cleaners, some of them are factory workers, some of them are security guards, policemen, and they have them from the army, from the Air Force. They have them from all different walks of community. Many of them are doctors, and they all have these ideas of how the country can be better. And they present them to the National People's Congress twice a year. And when these things are presented, then they're voted on. This is what they call the rubber stamp parliament. They're voted on, but all the work has been done in the background. If they're not popular, if they're not going to be accepted, then they're never presented for a vote. So the West says, oh, it's a rubber stamp parliament because everything gets selected. But these people are actually monitoring the CPC. The NPC are looking after the CPC and making sure the CPC don't overstep their mark, don't do what they shouldn't do. And I think when you talked about ripping apart the fabric of society and the fabric of your structures, China is actually putting them together and making them work together. They're saying the people can tell the party. It literally is a dictatorship of the proletariat. And it literally is, and it works very, very well. Now, 90% of people, if you talk to them, will say, oh, I don't pay any attention to it. Well, they don't pay any attention to it because they don't need to. It's like a great football game. If you watch a football game and you don't see the referee, that was a good refereeing game. When the referee is constantly interfering in the game, then you don't enjoy the game as much. And that's what happens in Chinese politics. It's actually working very, very well because of this melding of the people with the party to govern the country in the way the country wants to be governed. Could that ever happen in America?
Absolutely not. China has as you said, it's a dual system. It's the party dictatorship and it's a people's democracy. We just have a veneer of a constitutional republic. And then our democracy, the content of our democracy is the opposite in China. So in China, the NPC is if I'm correct, that's the people's democracy. So democracy in China is inherently people oriented, arguably populistic. But that, I guess that might be controversial to call it that. But in the United States, when politicians and when the media talks about democracy, they're actually referring to elite civil society institutions funded by billionaires and think tanks, such as George Soros's Open Society Foundation, to basically maintain and keep in check popular aspirations, to make sure that people's will doesn't get united in such a way that disrupts the neutrality, so-called neutrality of the system. And the neutrality of the system is just a kind of veneer of just allowing basically oligarchs to continue engaging in corruption and economic plundering and whatnot in the name of a kind of free market or whatever, right? So democracy in America means the exact opposite of what it means in China. And You know, and it's ironic because populism in America insists more upon the Republican, constitutional Republican side of things, where no, the forces of democracy, the Soros Open Society or whatever, are an inhibition and preventing, our will to be represented as the perceived the founding fathers intended it to be, which is, town hall republicanism, real democracy. So I'm mentioning this because I think the germ of what China has, as you describe, exists in America. It's ingrained in people's consciousness that more or less this is what the founding fathers and the spirit of the American Revolution intended. It's just
Yeah.
that because I argue, I mean, this is maybe Marxist dogmatism, but it is my perspective. Because we only had the bourgeois revolution, the democratic revolution, we never had a proletarian revolution. We don't have an added layer of civilizational and historical wisdom that China has, which also recognizes the factor of class struggle and class differences. And I think that's exactly why, as you mentioned, China's a proletarian dictatorship, also because it's very cognizant of how elite social formations and private interests can form in ways that inhibit the common will of the people. And its structures are in place to make sure that that doesn't happen, to ensure that people will always have representation, not just as a kind of abstract generality, but actually the people, the masses, the farmers, the street workers, the factory workers, and so on, who are at
It
the
sounds
lower
like
rungs of
it
society.
sounds like you have an understanding of why the Cultural Revolution started.
Oh,
This
yes,
this
precisely.
this is exactly what Mao saw happening. Now, don't get me wrong, the Cultural Revolution went out of control and became unmanageable, but the purpose of starting it was exactly what you just say. The institutions were becoming too institutionalized, and the leadership was becoming too institutionalized, and there was a danger of exactly what they had overthrown 30, 40 years before becoming the same thing. And that's possibly, I mean, it's a very difficult thing to say, why did Mao start that? But it was definitely, that was a component of it.
There were definitely excesses in the Cultural Revolution. I'm not
Mm.
trying to idealize it, but I hold the perspective, and I'm not exactly sure. I don't know if I discussed this with my Chinese friends I met in Moscow, but I think the reason China endured, rather than the USSR, was because of the Cultural Revolution. That is what
Okay.
created a precedent and an experience that made people realize that institutions constantly need to be humbled and invigorated with the popular element, or else it's going to be a source of extreme instability, like we saw in the later stages of the Cultural Revolution.
Mm.
Whereas in the Soviet Union, the exact same dynamic that Mao was worried about happened unchallenged. And it eventually culminated in the destruction of the socialist system itself.
Mm. What are the obstacles that will prevent the MAGA communism movement from growing and becoming that alternative third party? There must be some significant obstacles.
Well, there's three main adversaries we have. And I think as long as we continue to be steadfast in confronting these three adversaries, I don't think we will have an issue creating a, and I don't mean a third party in the sense we're going to be elected president, but I mean a tribune of the people, a party that finally masses of people regard as theirs and representing their interests in
Mhm.
ways that the established parties cannot. So the three main adversaries we face, and they're all related, is firstly, our first adversary were what I call pan leftists. So pan leftism basically encompasses a broad spectrum of liberals, Trotskyites, anarchists, ultra leftists, basically people who are, I guess, eclectically leftist and tangentially aligned with the Democratic Party, who are very, very hostile to what we're trying to accomplish here. Again, because it undermines their kind of class position as institutional gatekeepers. And they also see fit to regard the kind of Chinese style populism we're talking about as fascist, right?
Mhm.
Drawing from Karl Popper and these more late liberal theorists of democracy. So that is the first adversary. The second adversary, I think, comes from the far right, who are trying to compete with us in terms of winning the consciousness of the MAGA people. And I think, although they are less numerous than the pan leftists, they are formidable because they have a bad faith agenda to malign our attempts to communicate communism to the MAGA masses, doing everything they can to block us and obstruct us. Not because they're coming from the same place that MAGA people are, but because they, think they're going to convince people to like be neo-Nazis or something, which they won't. So, I mean, but from both flanks, the threat is a purely destructive one. We're not worried that they're going to create a positive movement that competes with us, but they play a destructive role to stifle our attempts. I mean, pan leftists are rooting for our downfall. They're rooting us to fail very desperately. Instead of, it's very funny, instead of actually trying to build anything themselves whatsoever, they realize, yeah, we're not going to be able to do that. But let's dedicate the entirety of our energy to bring these guys down and prevent them from being successful. So we see odd, weird scenarios where sometimes the two people I just mentioned team up. And it's not just the far right, it's also kind of conservative influencers, quote unquote, who make a living off of propagating the narratives of the establishment Republican Party and whatnot. And they kind of unite together to delegitimize us. And they have a gentleman's agreement, pan leftists and the right wing, where they say, okay, we hate each other, but we understand our position and where we stand with regard to one another. And we will maintain our social status and our credibility as long as we keep the game up of just going at it, red versus blue. And, they have that gentleman's agreement. And then worse, wedged in between, fighting both of them, because we want to destroy their gentleman's agreement. We want to destroy their established position and open the floodgates to a totally new kind of environment of politics in the U.S. So, and then finally, the third adversary, which does unite the two together in functionally in practice, is the hegemony, including the deep state, including the forces of state-sponsored disinformation and botting and whatnot. Journalists contacted I was on Twitch. I got banned from a Washington, D.C. think tank tied to the Brookings Institute and the Soros Foundation and all this kind of liberal think tanks and NGOs. That's all CIA. We all know that, right? And that force is kind of tied to social media, and it's also the repressive apparatuses of the state as well. So it's those three main adversaries that stand in the way of the success of our efforts to rebuild communism in America, basically.
Do you find it sometimes hopeless? Because that's three fairly substantial adversaries there.
It can feel that way sometimes when you realize that we are in the minority right now. And we're fighting a war of defending ourselves in many ways. But I also find it interesting how seamlessly we are able to kind of operate and grow in significance just by stating a painful but obvious truth that is inconvenient. And I think that the power of that message is so strong that it allows us to hold our own and allows some of us to go. Jackson Hinkle is one of us. I mean, when I met Jackson, he was not well known by anyone. He had about 30,000 subscribers on YouTube. He was a very minuscule figure compared to where he is now. And the amount of connections we've able to make, obviously the popularity Jackson has been able to achieve, things of that nature. I mean, we have come a long, long way at this point. And it's because of the power, the uniqueness, and most importantly, the integrity of our message. Because it takes, for an enemy to lie about us, it takes a lot of energy compared to how easy it is for us to just tell the truth. I mean, it's much more difficult for them to lie. Put
My
it this way.
channel is very much about that. Um, I focus purely and simply on American missing. It is all American. Some of it comes from the UK. I'm an Australian citizen as well, so a lot of this comes from Australia. But it is fundamentally American misinformation being fed to those countries in order to make China look bad. And my life is spent. It's not how I planned my retirement, but my retirement is actually spent just saying to these people, you're wrong, and this is why you're wrong. Here's the truth. Here's the reality. And then backing it up and supporting it. It's very difficult to argue with that. So I understand where you're coming from. I particularly liked one comment that you just made a little while ago, where you said these people are not out to set up in competition to you. They're out to destroy you. And that probably is a more telling message than anything else. If you don't have a viable alternative, why don't you just leave us alone? Because we are an alternative. Why won't they just leave you alone?
I think there's an extent that they feel, some of them, in some cases, there is a kind of, it seems like it's coming from the third adversary, where
Right.
it really is just kind of really bad faith actors doing this on behalf of the hegemony because they're employed to. It's their job. But I can't say that's all of it, or maybe even most of it, from the pan leftist front. I think many of them feel humiliated that for so long they've been doing the wrong thing, and then suddenly we're out here with a winning message that's successful, and it kind of makes them feel like their whole life was meaningless, basically. Like, okay, I've gotten to the position that I am, as much as I failed, and you're just going to come along here and do this. No, I'm not. I don't think so. And I think it's a classic kind of gatekeeper dynamic. And you see it play out in so many different contexts all the time, where the more rational thing, you're right, is for them to just, go do, if we're so wrong, you figure it out. But one of our adversaries, his name is Hassan Piker. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but I think he said something very, very illustrative of their mentality. He said, listen, leftism is not about success. It's about constantly failing over and over again. And then every once in a while, you might have a marginal success to hope for, but it's basically about being correct and constantly ineffective because of you're correct. And kind of just, for him, that means being principled, constantly failing, but you're correct. So when we're actually trying to make an effort to be successful, it's almost like they feel like we're disturbing their peace. They are at peace being failures while repping the name of socialism or left-wing politics or communism. And if someone is going to come along being successful in the usage of those kinds of labels, they feel like it's disrupting this kind of cognitive, emotional, and ideological safe space they've cultivated, which ultimately they're content with.
I get people on my feed every day. Without a doubt, there'll be some every day, usually small numbers. I handle about 500 or 600 messages a day through my YouTube, my Twitter, and things like that. And almost every day I'll see someone say, but communism has failed everywhere. I mean, you look at how America is so successful and communism has failed everywhere. And then they quote, Venezuela is still poor, Cuba is still poor, North Korea is still poor, China is still poor. Well, hang on a second. Do you realize that your country has been sanctioning those countries for 70 years in some cases? And China was poor for the first 20 years of its existence because of US sanctions. I mean, this really, you can't say that it's failed. You can say it's been collapsed or it's been caused to fail. It's being pushed into poverty because of what you're doing. And I would love to see just one country. And China is obviously clearly an example of this, but one country just left alone by the US. Instead of what you said before, they try, because they don't like it, they try to destroy it, rather than say, okay, let's see how it goes. And if you just leave Cuba alone for 10 years and let it trade internationally, let it do what it does, what would Cuba look like in 10 years' time? And I'm sure it'll be very different from what it looks like today, where it is still very poor. Same with the DPRK. Not very democratic country, I'll grant you, but the fact is, the people there, and I know people I've met people who come from there, they're not unhappy with what they have. They're quite happy. Yet I'm told that Chinese people also live with this yoke of oppression, and they need rescuing from their government. If you walk out in the streets, you wouldn't see anybody who needs rescuing here. It's really quite a happy place. So what's going wrong with this? Is this thing that you say they just want to destroy it, and this is something that needs to change, and it really is American driven. Why are they so emphatic about communism being failure?
Again, not to be dogmatic, but I think my Marxist perspective would trace this to a phenomena Lenin identified. The rise of imperialism corresponded to something that was also called the rise of monopoly capitalism. With the economic competition kind of disappears, and the law of competition, the law of the market has given rise to these dynastic monopolies, which actually still rule the U.S. today, financial monopolies. And once they've reached the point of monopoly, it's very clear how the increased dynamism and productivity and change of the productive forces and of the economy actually begins to threaten their position on a structural level. So you see increasing rhetoric, and this was especially thrown at China in the 2000s before Xi Jinping's kind of transition to ecological civilization. But it's a very cynical attempt to try and hinder economic development for other countries in general in the name of combating climate change, for example, right? Which was a very cynical and bad faith veneer they were using. The real reason, of course, is because they didn't want the competition. The monopolies couldn't afford it because it would mean their destruction on a structural level, which for them may as well be the equivalent of the destruction of everything, right? But the destructive and antisocial nature of monopoly capital, and particularly finance capital, and this is something Michael Hudson, the economist, talks about often, is that it is driven toward the goal of basically devastating the productive forces, and if you can even argue the foundation of civilization itself in many ways, because it increasingly begins to view them all as just costs, pure costs. Once you have a monopoly, your only way of acquiring profit is basically cutting back costs. That's how your profit margins increase, by having to account and pay for less. And that logic taken to its conclusion basically means just pure destruction. It's almost like what a great profit we're able to make if we just destroy everything. Like, if the dollar gets worth less for more commodities that are produced, right, because of the forces of inflation or whatnot, I mean, $1 would be worth the whole universe if we just destroy everything. And it's almost like it's a famous quote from Dune, I think. It's like, he who has the power to destroy something can control it. And I think there's a very twisted, perverse logic or mentality that it's at the core of this kind of antisocial, anti-civilization destructiveness that the West, or in America in particular, has gotten itself into, which, according to which, basically, it would be better for everything to be torn down because nothing new is possible, nothing novel is possible, and we've basically reached the end of history already, and there's no going forward from here.
And that for the United States?
Yeah, I mean, it's Fukuyama's argument of liberal democracy kind of reaching the end of history, being the final and most perfect system there is. And I think that is an inherently destructive perspective, because to maintain an equilibrium, an exact stasis, that has to come at the expense of something. And I mean, there's, I guess I'm underselling the extent to which there's something very malign, sinister, and vicious about the imperialist agenda. But it also, I think, is rooted in just a kind of logical consequence of monopoly, I think.
Right. So we're getting towards the end of my allotted time. I usually allow about 90 minutes for this. What's next for MAGA? Where are we going next?
Next is 2024, which I think is the ultimate test. I
Right.
think if Trump loses in 2024, it's not, it sounds outlandish, but I think the polarization in this country will reach a tipping point that might be something like a civil war.
Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe
Do
not
you
as
have
dramatic as that, as like two forces going at it, but just a general breakdown of authority, law and order to the point of, an unclear political situation in the US, I think, is another word for civil war, where who is president? Well, we don't agree on it, and the
yeah.
country's divided over it.
So you think it's as soon as November if the wrong result or if the result is not what the MAGA communists want or the MAGA people want, then it could be over as early as November.
Or maybe it's fizzled out, and among younger generations, the MAGA movement is no longer the zeitgeist, or maybe Trump can win, and it's liberal states that decide to secede, Democrat
Okay.
states. So the polarization is not just from one side; it's also from the
Understood.
other.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you have anybody in Senate, Congress, anybody in administration who supports what you do?
I don't believe, not yet, though there are people who seem to be close to us on foreign policy, and increasingly so, I think.
Mm.
And I think for a long time, for many of these people, it was kind of like opposition to U.S. foreign policy on Russia, but hawkish on China.
Right.
But I think that's starting to change. I noticed, I think Tucker Carlson is starting to become a little more skeptical of U.S. posturing against China. I think that among the representatives I'm talking about, like Thomas Massey and others, I think they're also kind of starting to come around to the realization that China is not the enemy, actually. China is not in bed with, the establishment or whatever. Because,
We had
the
I was going to say we had Gavin Newsom over here, the governor of California, just a few months ago, and he was very enamored with what he saw. Really, the fact is, Americans need to come and have a look for themselves and say, "Wow, this is not what we expected."
I totally agree. And I think among the MAGA movement, the hostility from China stems from a few factors. One of which is that there are bad faith forces, the Steve Bannon, Peter Thiel kind of crowd, who are, in league with the Department of Defense, that are kind of trying to psyop people against China. The second thing is China is a very unfamiliar, foreign, and alien place for many Americans. So there's a kind of xenophobia there that's just automatic. And then the third thing is there is a perception that a false conspiracism that somehow the Democrats are doing China's bidding and that China runs the show in America. So they associate the hegemony with China. And
Yeah.
that's so funny because they don't realize that the hegemony is more concerned with bringing down China than it is MAGA internally. So you and China actually share a common enemy, is what
Yeah.
I always try to tell MAGA people. The Chinese are fighting the same fake news media that you are. They're fighting the same destructive forces that you're trying to. And that's really the kind of angle with much success, actually, we try to educate people on China.
I had an interesting chat yesterday with a grassroots MAGA, and this is what I wanted to do. So you know that I've talked to a few people, and this guy came in yesterday. I just know him as James. He identifies as a MAGA communist and said, "Yeah, I'm willing to talk to you." So we set it up, and he was very interesting on China because he actually likes the country. He said he'd love to visit, and he doesn't believe much of what he says, and it's refreshing for me to hear that coming from an American voice. It really is refreshing because I visit Australia and I dare not go to a bar in Australia and say, "Oh, I live in China. It's a great place." I wouldn't leave there with my head intact. It's as simple as that. There's that much anti-China rhetoric in Australian media. It's possibly worse than America, but so far seeing people outside of America who say, well, I don't believe all that, it really is refreshing for me. And this is something I really encourage you and your team to kind of get out there. The lies in the media about you are exactly the same as the lies in the media about China.
Precisely, and that's part. I mean, one of the biggest things about MAGA communism, I guess, to conclude, is what it's distinct from other kind of MAGA voices is that we are pro China. We are trying to dispel animosity and hostility toward China. It's one of our chief and principal goals because we consider it our responsibility because of the US's aggressive posturing against China. We need to step up and obstruct the deep state's attempt to build consensus for a war with China.
It's very much a military industrial complex driven program. It's not in the benefits of any of humanity at all, let alone America, because a war with China would, without a shadow of a doubt, bring a war to America. I don't think there's any doubt about that. It will be the first time, and I think maybe we should probably use that as a finishing point. Let's hope that MAGA communism grows in strength. I came into this series of 3 videos with a very open mind, and I didn't know if I was going to like MAGA communism or dislike it. What I've seen and the 3 people that I've talked to and the research that I've done, I see that is a positive thing for America, and I wish you all the greatest success with it. And to Jackson Hinkle, the future president, maybe all the best to you. So thank you very,
so
very much. No, thank you, Haz. It's been a pleasure talking to you. We haven't. It's very early in the morning here in China, so we haven't had that many followers today. But I think your site has been quite busy. This has only got 70, 80 people on, but it's a good start for you. I mean, I hope there will be more. I intend to write an article for publication and put all of this together. And yeah, I think my article will be a very positive one. So
thank you so much. I'll be sure to share the video with my followers as well.
Okay,
and it was really a pleasure to come on.
Thank you, Haz. I will see you next time. Let's see if next time we talk that you're advising a future president.
Hopefully, yeah. Fingers crossed.